During this session, we're going to talk about security sector reform and security sector transformation. 4 things I hope to get out of this presentation as I go through it today. First, it's a phrase that gets used a lot, but really, what does it mean? Second, what is the difference between organizational change and security sector reform? Third, what are the linkages between rule of law and security sector reform? And lastly, why is this important to you? Why did we include this within the syllabus and take an hour plus out of your time here in Washington to talk about security sector reform and security sector transformation? Well, the title of this presentation is Security Sector Transformation, but I'm going to discuss both security sector transformation and security sector reform. I'll offer a distinction between the two at times during the presentation, but I'll also use the terms interchangeably from time to time. And when I talk about them differently, I'll try to make a point on what's transformation and what's reform. And hopefully I'm successful at the distinction between the two, and I'll ask you to let me know during the question and answer session if there's still any debate or disagreement between security sector reform and security sector transformation. One of the objectives for this session, which my colleague Dr. Brico brought out, was to talk about this paradigm shift between regime security and state security versus human security and the role of the security sector. My personal view is I think the shift has already occurred. I think, at least on the knowledge and awareness level, it has occurred. I've been involved in several of these iterations with your type class, the Next Generation course, and I've been in several with the Senior Leaders course that we run, and many other conferences, seminars, symposiums, and workshops, talk fest, if you will, on African security issues. And I've never met anyone who's disagreed with this. And I think everyone recognizes that there is a shift afoot for the security sector and security sector institutions to focus on human security over state security or regime security. However, the challenge is in implementation, as always. How do we go about implementing? Hopefully what we'll do in the next few minutes is try to establish some points of reference on security sector reform and transformation, when security sector reform is needed, and look at some of the key actors. Then I'd like to spur debate on how to accomplish it. This presentation will not give you a blueprint or a step-by-step on how to do security sector transformation and reform. So if you came here hoping to get that, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Rather, I want to get us thinking about it and debate it among ourselves. Why? Because you all are the real experts on this subject, not me. You live and work this every day. So I want to throw out some ideas and some thoughts, get you thinking, stimulate the debate, and then hear back from you on what you think about security sector reform and transformation. Okay, this slide on the screen may look a little bit familiar to you. I think Professor Dempsey threw a version of it up last week for you to look at. I've made a couple of small changes on it. And what I did is I put the security sector box on the top. And then underneath it, I lined the civil society and the state oversight. Why? That's to show the accountability aspect of the security sector. You have your providers of security in the top box, and then you have the underpinnings for the security sector underneath it in what's labeled civil society and state oversight. So if you look at the providers of security and you think about the human dimension of security, there is a need for security among the people and within society. And it's a need that they usually look to the government to provide. It's a social contract. But if it's not provided by the state, it may get filled by other means. There's a void created when the state does not provide security. Something may fill that void. So it's really up to the state to decide how they're going to provide security, knowing that if they don't, something else might. And with that in mind, I'll ask you to look at the last line in that top box, where it mentions private security and non-state actors. You may have heard this earlier in your course thus far, and I'm not sure. But have you talked about what is the most violent place in Africa? I know a lot of people, if you ask that, they'll say, well, it has to be Libya. Or some will say, no, it's Somalia. Or others might even say northern Nigeria or the Lake Chad Basin. But statistically, the most violent place in Africa is South Africa. And if you look at South Africa, the private security industry there is huge. Why? Because it's filled a void within the security sector that society demands must be met. The state doesn't meet it, but it's being met through the private security companies. In South Africa, there's a company called Protea Coin, which does cash and transit protection. They have 17,000 licensed security officers that work for that company. There's another company called Fidelity Corporate Services. It's the largest private security company in South Africa. They have 26,000 licensed security officers. As a reference point, the entire Defense Force of Senegal is about 20,000. So we're talking about 26,000 security officers from one company operating in a $6 billion per year industry in South Africa. And we think about South Africa as one of the most developed in Africa. But think about that. There's this void there of security that's not provided by the state, but yet it's filled. Now, you could argue that private security companies are quasi-state actors because in South Africa they have regulation, they have licensing. But now let's think about Somalia. What about non-state actors? Al-Shabaab in Somalia, why did they gain traction initially? And I don't want to oversimplify this, because obviously there's a lot of reasons. But one aspect of it was they were providing a need for rule of law and a need within the security sector. They were filling a void that wasn't being filled by the government. I think about my time that I spent in Afghanistan. It's the same way. Part of the Taliban's base level support was providing and filling a void that wasn't there in the security sector from the government. So what's the difference between security sector reform and transformation? And on the slide, you'll see some definitions, and I'll just give you a second to read through those rather than reading them myself. I think there's a common perception on security sector reform that it means starting all over, building from the ground up, that we're going to recreate or create a new military. So people kind of assume the transformation piece, and they lump the two together. Think about the situation in Liberia and what happened there, or what's happening now in Somalia. There they are recreating the entire security sector, but yet people still call it security sector reform. But if you look at the two definitions, you'll see that security sector reform is to improve the way the security sector provides safety and security. It's a set of policies, plans, and programs. So it presupposes functional institutions to some level that already exist. Whereas transformation, it talks about being a complex task that transforms the security sector. So in some respects, if you take what happened in Liberia, you take what they're doing in Somalia now, you would argue that that's security sector transformation. They're building something new from scratch. So think about that. With that, then, I ask you the question, Which do you think is harder? Security sector transformation or security sector reform? I would argue that it's security sector reform. And maybe that's counterintuitive. Maybe some of you were thinking transformation. And here's why I think that way. I think it's harder to reform and make substantive change in the security sector while you're already a functioning institution, even if the institutions are somewhat weak or somewhat ineffective. They're institutions that are already providing it. They're doing it. So to step back and make fundamental change while they're functioning, it's difficult. Whereas if you start from scratch and you're building anew, I don't say it's easy, but it's a little bit easier in that context. Now let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. I mentioned Afghanistan earlier. And when I was in Afghanistan, one of the jobs I had was to train the Afghan police in southern Afghanistan. And this may surprise you, or maybe it won't. But what we did for the training eventually was we would take the entire police force from a district and pull them out. Every single police person from a district to provide training for them. Because what we found is the majority of these policemen, they never had any training at all. They were just put in a uniform. Sometimes they didn't have a uniform, and they were called police. So they stepped into this role to become a policeman, and in many cases, really what they became was a predator. And their skill sets were manning checkpoints, shaking down vehicles, and they were nominally police. So in order to make fundamental change, we had to pull out the entire force and train them. What we tried to do, we tried to train recruits and put them in. We saw that was ineffective, because no matter how well you trained a recruit, once he went into the culture of this organization, which we all talked about, I guess it's been almost 2 weeks ago now, about changing the culture in an organization, it didn't work. These policemen immediately assumed the culture of the organization they entered into. So you couldn't do it by training individuals. So we found to make change, we had to pull out the entire police force and train them. And you could do that in Afghanistan because, one, they weren't providing much security to begin with. So when you pulled them out, it actually gave the people a bit of a respite. But now think about what I said about what's harder and easier, reform or transformation. Now take the case of, say, Nairobi. Could you go into neighborhoods in the city of Nairobi and pull out the entire police force to do training? What would happen? You'd have chaos. I mean, you couldn't do it. Think about where we are right now in Arlington, Virginia. You cannot take the entire police force of Arlington, Virginia and pull them out and do training. You have to work it incrementally. You have to have a focus of how you do it. So I would argue that's one reason why it's much tougher to do security sector reform than transformation. With transformation, you get a chance to start over. With reform, it's almost as if you're repairing the airplane while it's flying in the air. So why do we have to do security sector reform? Well, it usually comes from two things. One is insecurity, and two is inefficiency, but frequently it's both. So when I say insecurity, what we're really talking about is trying to address the threats of today. And with inefficiency, you can kind of look at it as setting up your organization to address the challenges of tomorrow. And this also goes back to why I would argue that security sector reform is a little tougher than transformation. Because for security sector transformation, you're trying to solve a problem of today. And everyone's focused on it. You have this insecurity aspect. So people focus on the security sector transformation to get at the insecurity. But when you're looking to the future and you're trying to improve the efficiencies, you're trying to organize your security sector to handle the challenges for the future. And then you have to figure out what are the second and third order effects for some of these challenges. And that's tough. It's hard. If you look at the basic elements of security sector reform and security sector transformation, the first bullet talks about allegiance to the state rather than the leaders, regimes, or parties. What this really comes down to is legitimacy. And legitimacy is the prerequisite for security sector reform. You can do all the reform and changing you want, But if you don't have legitimacy, it's not going to be effective, and it won't last. A lot of times there's rhetoric about having militaries that are apolitical, not involved in politics, and civilian control of the military. And of course, these are sound principles. However, if the civilian control is an authoritarian regime, or it's a regime that doesn't respect the rights of the people, or a regime that creates human security challenges, then the security sector is part of the problem. Just because you have an apolitical security sector, or a security sector that defers to civilian oversight, that doesn't mean that it's a good security force that's going to meet the criteria for effectively providing both human security and state security. So first and foremost, legitimacy is a prerequisite. The next 2 points on this slide are related. Force structure and doctrine must reflect the country's needs and interest, and a force size constrained by the government's ability to pay salaries. This comes down to what we talked about in the first block during your program here, and that's strategy. This really emphasizes the importance of a national security strategy. When you're talking about the force structure, the doctrine, and then the resources, the ability to pay salaries. If you're going to reform and transform a security sector, you need a strategy. Remember, strategy lays out what you're trying to achieve. What are the ends? But then you have to align the ways and the means against it. Look at the 6th bullet on this slide. Must be tied to financial ministry reforms. And that's a key. A strategy without resources is just a piece of paper. It's not a strategy. One point I'd like you to think about is that the security sector itself has to buy into this idea of security sector reform. If you just mandate security sector reform, but you don't have the buy-in of the security forces themselves, I would argue it's not effective. They need to see the advantages. And part of that is the resources. If the security forces see that they're getting the resources, that they're being paid, that they know they're going to have a pension when they retire, that they have proper equipment, that their families are being taken care of, now they're part of this process. Now they're invested in it. So if you don't have those resources, you're not going to be effective. Even more important than the strategy is the resources to implement the strategy. Now, the most important point on this slide is the last point, in my opinion. The one that says, eschew ill-fitting foreign templates for doctrine, strategy, design. I mentioned Liberia earlier. Think back on Liberia's security sector transformation. For the most part, it was a U.S.-led effort funded by the U.S. State Department. It was contracted out to a private company. People came in, and granted, they worked with Liberians, and they worked with the ministry. And I'm not saying it was totally imposed as a U.S. solution, but it was pretty much led and run from the outside based on a foreign template. I think that you could argue that that's what's happening in Somalia right now. A few months ago, I was speaking with a brigadier general from New Zealand, and he works for the UN in Somalia. His job is to try to coordinate all the international efforts that are going on in Somalia to bring about security sector transformation, to build the army, to integrate different agencies. And that's a very hard job. But in all that, what he's really doing, what he told me he's really doing, he's trying to integrate what Turkey's doing in Somalia, what the United Arab Emirates are doing in Somalia, what the U.S. wants to do in Somalia, what the EU wants to do in Somalia. It's really where the bulk of his work is. It's not on what the Somalis want to do in Somalia. There's an AU framework document on security sector reform, and hopefully some of you have seen it. Who here is familiar with the AU document, AU framework document on security sector reform? Anyone seen that document? Not as many as I'd hoped. Okay, your homework after this session. Look up this document online. It's very short. It's the AU Framework Document on Security Sector Reform, and read it. It's a great document. It's what I talked about earlier about we know about the shifting paradigm, the troubles in implementing it. The AU Framework Document lays it out. But let me read you a quote, getting back to the foreign templates, of a section which is in the AU Framework Document. It says, quote, security sector reform processes have been mostly informed by externally generated policy frameworks and assumptions that often do not necessarily align with the realities and sources of insecurity for African peoples, states, and societies. Close quote. And here's the other thing with these external templates or influence on the SSR process. Most of these foreign actors, they come in with a defense-centric approach to security sector reform. They come in and they want to reform the military. And they'll often start with DDR. They'll come in and say, how do we get the Army right? And then maybe they'll talk about the Air Force. Maybe they'll talk about the Navy. And every once in a while, you have small outliers who will work with the police. But for the most part, when these foreign entities come in with their resources and their objectives to meet their national interest, it's very much defense force-centric. But the security sector needs to get away from a defense force-centric model. If you look at what's happening on the continent and you look at the threats and challenges, most of them are internal operations. Look at what's happening with Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin area in northern Nigeria. Look at what happened in the Central African Republic, Mali, Somalia. These are internal, where rule of law needs to be strengthened and the internal security situation needs to be improved. And the starting point for that frequently is not the defense forces. But yet when the external actors come in, that's usually their strategy. Work with the military, defense force centric. If you go to any planning session, I'll speak from the U.S. perspective, and they're talking about objectives and trying to form what I'll call partnerships with the African nations, they'll always throw out security sector reform. There's a need for security sector reform. Well, I would challenge you as you go back to think about that and think about this point about foreign templates. Generally, the person with the resources calls the shots. It's a fact. But yet, the foreign template and the foreign doctrine oftentimes, as the AU framework document said, does not meet the needs and the sources of insecurity of African peoples, states, and societies. Okay, so what's the good news on all this? And Professor Dempsey's given this presentation before, and I don't know if he talked about it last week in the rule of law, but he gets all excited about this slide. He says, you know, the Africans have figured it out. You know, they're the ones at the forefront. They're leading the way. And Tom's absolutely right. The good news is that there's some lessons learned in Africa on some of the trends in security sector reform and transformation. But it's more than just understanding. Understanding it and implementing it, that's two different things. And I think we know a lot about what needs to be done, but the hard part is getting the resources and then having the strategic plan that links the resources with the ends. Rule of law. I think you had a session on rule of law last week. Is that right, Tom? Where you talked specifically about rule of law? Absolutely, rule of law is the key to security sector reform and transformation. Did you give the example of the Civil Rights Act in the U.S. last week when you talked about rule of law? Okay, let me give you an example from the U.S. perspective on security sector reform. And remember I talked earlier about the difference between an organizational change and actual real security sector reform and transformation. In U.S. history, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And in the U.S., up to that point, the minority population was oppressed, for lack of a better term. And the security forces in many areas of the country, by the police and the other actors, repressed the minority population. And there was this ingrained sense among certain portions of the population that our minority population was inferior or didn't warrant the same rights, or they could be treated differently. And to try to bring out the transformation from the ground up within the police forces, within the security sector, it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. It was 100 years since the end of the Civil War. It had not happened yet. So something major had to happen. What happened was the state acted. They passed legislation to force change. They imposed upon the security sector to make sure that there was equal protections of human security for all people. That's an example of the linkage between the rule of law and the security sector and the way these framework documents on this slide work. Okay, a little more on this intersection of the rule of law and the security sector. You see the word no impunity on this slide. It's critical to get the support of the populace. Every security force has bad actors. Mentioning again my time in Afghanistan, there was an instance where we had some soldiers that went out and murdered civilians. And many of you may have read this in the paper. There's been allegations in northern Nigeria by soldiers of abuses in their fight against Boko Haram. Fairly recently, there were reports of peacekeepers from France committing atrocities in Africa. It happens in every organization. There's bad actors. But the issue is about impunity. It's what happens next after these bad actors act. That's the important part. It's the investigation process. It's the rule of law. It's making sure that people are held accountable for their actions, and then that the populace sees that the state is taking action. And that's what makes the difference. That's what has to happen. Establishing norms for accountable security forces. Let me ask you all a question. Do you think security sector reform and transformation is more of a top-down approach, or is it bottom-up, or is it a mix of both? And almost every time I ask this question, everyone says it's a mix of both. Again, I'm going to be contrarian, and I'm going to argue that it's mostly a top-down process. Here's why. Every organization, for the most part, tries to be a learning organization. They want to get better. When you get someone new in the job, or you get a boss or a new supervisor or a new employee, they want to learn what they're doing, and then they want to make things better. And there's always organizational change. And a lot of the time that happens from the bottom up and the top down, or a mix of both, where organizations want to change to become more efficient, become more effective. But organizational change is not security sector reform. Reform and transformation has to start at the top. It begins with rule of law, and it begins with framework documents that establish norms and expectations for how the security sector needs to operate. So if we look at some of these framework documents, you'll see things like police acts, national defense acts. I mentioned the Civil Rights Act in the U.S. as an example of legislation that affects security sector reform. And you'll see on here the Constitution. I think it's worth talking about the Constitution a little bit. There's this conventional wisdom that the Constitution is the framework document that begins and ends all conversations on what the framework document for the security sector should be. But I would argue that if the Constitution doesn't have the respect of the people and legitimacy, it may not be a valid framework document. Frequently, constitutions are viewed as political tools. And in a lot of states, if the ruling party has an overwhelming majority in parliament, it's very easy to change a constitution. And people see that. So they don't necessarily view a constitution as that overarching document that provides accountability and compels the security sector to act within certain norms. A lot of times a government, an authoritarian regime may hold up the Constitution and they say, well, we're operating within the norms of our Constitution. But that may not be relevant if it's not a legitimate document in the eyes of the people. Let me give you an example from the U.S. perspective. If you would stop and ask any American on the street, I think that they would be able to explain to you several aspects of the Constitution. They'd probably be able to tell you how it applies to them in their daily life, what some of their rights are, and I think they would view it as an overarching framework document for how security is provided in the United States. In our Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, they use the Constitution to form the guiding principles for every decision they make. So I would argue that document has legitimacy. Okay, let's talk about the UK. The UK doesn't have a constitution. I don't know if everyone was aware of that. So I think sometimes there's this knee-jerk reaction that we hold the Constitution to a higher standard, and we should. But there's certain conditions that have to be met for a constitution to actually be this framework document that creates accountability and compels the security sector to act within certain norms. And I'm not saying constitutions are not important, they are. What I'm saying is that the legal framework documents that the security sector is based upon have to be valid. They have to be legitimate in order to be effective. And I know recently in the news there's instances of what happened in the Congo. And so they changed the Constitution. So think about that. If these constitutions are easily changed over time, if you have term limits, if you have other conditions that are in constitutions, but then when it doesn't meet the needs and wants of the regime of the day, now be it right or wrong, they may think they have valid national security interest, but it's still about the issues of today, not necessarily about the challenges of tomorrow that they want to make these changes. A lot of times it's for political expediency, and I would argue that that's not lost on the populace. Finally, let me go back one slide here. Let me talk about oversight. The rule of law and framework documents, they establish the norms, but the oversight for operating within those norms is provided from legislative control and authority, legislative oversight, parliamentary committees. It's provided through the civil society, local government. I would argue the international community has a role. Certainly the press and the media provide some measure of oversight. NGOs. There's a lot of actors to provide that oversight to make sure that the security sector is operating within those norms. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll remind you again of what we hope to accomplish in this presentation, and then we'll see if we succeeded in that when we do our question and answer. I wanted to talk about what security sector reform and transformation is. What's the difference between organizational change versus security sector reform? What are the linkages between rule of law and security sector reform? And lastly, why is it important to you? And hopefully we got at that, and I'm looking forward to our conversation and discussion here during the Q&A. Thank you very much.